The winter wind cut through the endless plains like a restless spirit, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. On the Callaway Ranch, a lone figure moved through the snow-dusted fields, his boots sinking slightly with each step. Jonah Callaway, a man of broad shoulders and steady hands, paused atop a rise, scanning the horizon. The sun had barely begun its climb, casting a pale light over the frosted land, and for a moment, the world seemed frozen in silence. Jonah's eyes, gray as storm clouds, carried a weight few could imagine. He had known love once, real, tender love, but death had a way of claiming what mattered most. His wife had passed 2 winters ago, leaving him with aching memories and a house that felt emptier than the wide plains themselves. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread, now echoed only with the creak of the floorboards. He could still see her at the window, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, smiling softly as the wind whispered through the trees. The ranch itself was a reflection of his solitude. The fences needed mending, the barn doors sagged under the weight of years, and the horses waited patiently, sensing the quiet desperation of their keeper. Yet Jonah was not a man to surrender easily. His life was built on the grit of hard work and the stubborn determination of a man who refused to bow to hardship. Still, as he surveyed the endless stretch of frozen land, he felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle deep in his chest. There were nights when the wind's howl seemed almost human, carrying whispers that reminded him of what he had lost. In the small town a few miles down the dusty road, neighbors would sometimes speak of Jonah with admiration, and occasionally, with a touch of pity. He was a man who could tame the wildest stallion, who could mend a fence with nothing but rope and sweat, yet he could not mend the hollow spaces left by love's absence. It was this loneliness, quiet but unyielding, that had led him to make a decision that would change the course of his life. Jonah had heard of mail-order brides before, of women traveling great distances to start anew in the West. He had never considered it seriously, until the winter nights grew longer, and the firelight cast shadows that reminded him of empty chairs and unanswered questions. He wanted more than a housekeeper or a companion. He wanted someone who could fill the silence with laughter, someone who could share in the burdens and joys of ranch life. And so, after long hours of writing letters and considering names, Jonah placed an order. He would not be alone again. He did not know who the woman would be, only that she would arrive soon, crossing miles of snow and prairie to reach his door. He allowed himself a small hope that this choice might bring warmth back into a house that had known too much cold. As the first evening shadows stretched across the snow, Jonah returned to the cabin, stacking firewood with methodical precision. He paused now and then, staring at the horizon as though expecting her to appear in the fading light, though he knew she could not. In his heart, he carried the mixture of fear and anticipation, the hope that she would be the answer to years of solitude, tempered by the knowledge that strangers sometimes had their own burdens, unknown and unseen. The wind rose again, shaking loose small flurries of snow that danced across the frozen fields. Jonah stood by the cabin door, taking in the quiet beauty of the plains, unaware that the arrival of Maribel Hayes would soon shatter the stillness of his life. She would not simply enter his home, she would challenge him, frustrate him, and slowly, in ways neither could yet imagine, begin to unravel the loneliness that had claimed him for so long. The stage was set. The snow-covered ranch awaited a visitor who would change everything, though Jonah had no idea just how fragile and complex that change would be. In the heart of winter, on the wide and unforgiving frontier, a new chapter was about to begin. The next morning, the sky was a hard, cold blue, the sun cutting through the winter haze with a weak, silver light. Jonah Callaway's horse pawed at the frozen ground impatiently as he rode toward the edge of town, eager for the arrival he had both anticipated and feared. Today, Maribel Hayes will come. The woman whose letters he had read carefully, whose presence he imagined nightly by the cabin hearth, was finally crossing the plains to reach him. Jonah's heart beat unevenly. He had known women before, of course. But none like this, none who carried the weight of a distant life, a past he could not yet see. The townsfolk gathered near the station, their breaths forming small clouds in the frigid air. Curiosity flickered in their eyes as they watched the lone stagecoach approach, drawn to the drama like moths to flame. Rumors had already swirled, whispers of the man who dared to buy a bride, of the woman who would step into his lonely home. The coach wheels creaked against the frozen ground, and Jonah's chest tightened. When the door swung open, she stepped out, a slender figure wrapped in a wool cloak, her face hidden beneath a hood. The wind lifted her dark hair in soft, rebellious strands, but still, she did not look at him. Not once. Not even as he approached, holding out a gloved hand. "Maribel Hayes?" Jonah said, his voice steady, though a flicker of uncertainty tugged at the edges. She remained silent. Her eyes, when they finally met his, were downcast, focused on the snow at her feet. She did not speak. She did not move toward him. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, sensing the tension, murmuring among themselves. Jonah swallowed the lump in his throat. He had expected shyness, perhaps some hesitation. But this cold, unwavering silence was something entirely different. It was as though she carried an invisible barrier, one he could not breach with words or gestures. And yet, Jonah did not retreat. He had come this far, and he would not turn back now. He helped her from the stagecoach, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "The cabin's not far. I'll take your bags." She nodded once, barely perceptible, and allowed him to lead her toward the ranch. The townsfolk watched in silence, curiosity mingling with unease. Some shook their heads, questioning the wisdom of bringing such a woman into the harsh frontier life. As they reached the cabin, Maribel's reluctance remained. She followed without complaint, but her movements were precise, measured, almost guarded. Jonah tried again, speaking softly as they stepped through the door. "I know this is sudden. You've traveled a long way. You must be cold and tired." Still, she did not look at him. Still, she did not answer. The only sound was the soft crunch of snow under boots, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling against the winter cold. Jonah felt a twinge of frustration, tempered by an understanding he could not fully name. She had a reason, he was certain of that, but what it was, he did not yet know. Inside, he showed her to her room, a modest space warmed by a small stove. He left a bundle of blankets neatly folded on the bed and stepped back, giving her space. "Rest. We'll talk when you're ready," he said, hoping his words would reach some corner of her guarded heart. As Jonah returned to the main room, he sensed the weight of the moment pressing down. Maribel Hayes had arrived, but she brought with her silence, a mystery that clung like frost to the windows. The townsfolk began to drift away, their whispers fading, leaving Jonah alone with the woman who would test his patience, his resolve, and, ultimately, his heart. He knew then that this was no ordinary marriage. This was a challenge of trust, a dance of caution and courage. And Jonah Calloway, rugged and steadfast as he was, felt the first tremors of a life that would never again be simple or quiet. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, carrying the promise of storms yet to come, and the unspoken truth that Maribel Hayes was no ordinary woman, and Jonah's heart was about to meet a force it had never faced before. The days that followed Maribel Hayes' arrival were a study in quiet tension. Jonah Calloway moved through the ranch with his usual precision, tending to the fences, feeding the horses, and chopping wood, yet each task felt heavier with her presence so close and yet so distant. He tried, in the small, careful ways he knew how, to bridge the silence, but every effort seemed to meet a wall of her steadfast quiet. He would speak softly as she passed him in the kitchen, commenting on the weather or the animals, hoping to draw a glance. She never looked up. Sometimes he caught her sketching in a small leather notebook, her hand moving quickly across the page, but her eyes remained distant, fixed not on him, but on some unseen memory he could not touch. Letters she had tucked away in a trunk he had been careful not to open yet peeked from the edges, hinting at stories he could not read, histories he could not know. Jonah's frustration grew, though he would never let anger rule him. He understood the frontier demanded patience, but this was different, this was unyielding. He tried a simple conversation at breakfast. "Did you sleep well?" he asked one morning, the stove casting long shadows across the cabin floor. She did not answer, dipping her head to the porridge before her. Evenings were the hardest. He would sit by the fire, hoping she might come to join him, perhaps offer a word or even a faint smile. But she remained in her corner, shoulders tight, eyes downcast. Jonah could feel the emptiness pressing in, heavier than the winter outside. He wanted to reach her, but he did not know how to pierce the wall she had built so carefully around herself. Then, subtle signs began to emerge, tiny cracks in her reserve that he noticed only because he watched so carefully. He saw her pause in the doorway when he laughed at a small joke to himself, or her hand lingering over a sketch for a fraction longer than necessary. He caught glimpses of her letters when she thought he wasn't looking, and the trunk she guarded as if it contained her very soul. Every clue pulled at his curiosity and deepened his sense that her silence was not indifference, but protection. The townsfolk, ever curious, whispered behind their hands. "She won't even look at him," they said, shaking their heads. "What's she hiding?" Their gossip reached Jonah's ears more than once. He shrugged it off publicly, but privately, it pressed on him. He wanted answers, not for the sake of the town, but because he longed to understand the woman he had brought into his home. One afternoon, as Jonah repaired a fence in the bitter wind, he noticed Maribel sketching by the barn. Her hand moved with precision, her eyes dark with focus. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "You have a gift," he said. No reply. He tried again, "Those are beautiful drawings." Her eyes flicked up, just a fraction, before returning to the page. That brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement stirred something in Jonah, a mixture of hope and sorrow, proof that she might one day trust him. Night fell, the wind rising in mournful gusts across the prairie. Jonah sat alone in the cabin, thinking of her, wondering how many winters she had endured before arriving at his door, how many moments of fear and loss had shaped the woman who refused to meet his gaze. He realized the challenge before him was more than patience, it was understanding, empathy, and courage. And so, he waited. He did not shout, nor did he scold. He worked, he observed, he listened to the silence that spoke louder than words. In that quiet, he began to sense the contours of her story, the weight she carried, and the care with which he must tread if he hoped to earn even the smallest fragment of her trust. For Jonah Calloway, life on the frontier had always been a test of endurance, but nothing had prepared him for the endurance required to reach the woman who would not speak, who would not look, and who carried a past heavy enough to break a man if revealed too soon. The ranch was quiet now, the snow drifting softly against the windows, and Jonah understood that this was only the beginning, the early consequences of a choice that would challenge every part of him, and perhaps, if he proved worthy, lead to a bond deeper than he had ever known. Winter had tightened its grip on the Calloway ranch, wrapping the land in frost and brittle winds that bit through even the sturdiest coat. Jonah Calloway moved through the snow-laden fields with careful determination, yet a part of his mind remained inside, watching Maribel Hayes as she quietly shaped her own routines within the cabin. He had learned to respect her silence, but curiosity gnawed at him. The sketches she drew, the letters she wrote in the privacy of her room, and the locked trunk she guarded so fiercely, all pointed to a story she had not yet shared. One evening, while repairing a broken fence, Jonah noticed a folded sketch pinned to the barn door, as if left deliberately, or perhaps carelessly, in plain view. He paused, heart pounding, and approached. The drawing was of a tall man with a roughened face, standing beneath a shadowed tree, a hint of menace in his posture. A chill ran through Jonah. He sensed danger, but also sorrow. The lines of the sketch suggested more than memory, they told a story of fear, of betrayal, of a life lived with caution. Over the next few days, Jonah observed her more closely, learning her rhythms without intrusion. He noticed the way she would glance toward the trunk with a mixture of longing and dread, how she tensed when certain townsfolk passed by, and how she sometimes murmured words he could not hear, as if talking to ghosts only she could see. Each clue deepened his understanding and heightened his desire to protect her, yet he knew pressing her too hard could break the fragile trust she had begun to allow. One late afternoon, as the sun sank behind the distant ridges, Jonah quietly opened the trunk, careful to respect her privacy while seeking answers. Inside were letters, sketches, and small mementos, each artifact revealing a past heavy with pain. One letter, yellowed and creased, spoke of a man named Silas Granger, notorious in several counties for robbery and violence. It became clear that Maribel had once been engaged to him, and that betrayal had cost her family dearly. The fear etched in her every glance and guarded gesture now made sense. She had learned, in the cruelest ways, that trust could be deadly. Jonah felt a surge of empathy and a deepening resolve. Her silence was not stubbornness, nor indifference, it was protection. She had built walls to keep herself safe, walls that he would need to approach with patience, kindness, and courage. And though he longed to see her smile, to hear her speak, he understood that such a moment could only come if he proved himself worthy. That night, as snow swirled around the cabin and the wind moaned through the eaves, Jonah sat by the fire and considered his next steps. He could try to push her, demand words, or insist on attention, but he knew that would only drive her further away. Instead, he resolved to demonstrate his sincerity through actions, small gestures that would show her she need not fear him. He would respect her boundaries, honor her space, and be steadfast, the one constant in a world that had taught her only betrayal. As the days passed, Jonah found opportunities to help her without intrusion. He repaired the roof to prevent drafts, brought firewood to her door, and left small notes of encouragement, simple phrases meant to ease rather than demand. He began to sense, in fleeting moments, tiny cracks in her armor, a glance toward him that lingered longer than necessary, a slight relaxation of posture when he entered the room. Each small sign was a victory, each gesture a promise that he would not harm her, that he was unlike anyone she had known. But tension remained. The past lingered like the frost outside, unspoken yet present, shaping every interaction between them. Jonah realized that the journey ahead would test him in ways the frontier never had, challenging his patience, his courage, and his understanding of love. And in that realization, he also sensed possibility, a fragile, shimmering hope that through trust, protection, and compassion, Maribel might one day allow him into the secret heart she had so carefully guarded. The following weeks brought more snow, the plains outside the Callaway Ranch stretching white and unbroken, a vast wilderness of cold and quiet. Jonah Callaway moved through it with steady purpose, tending to his chores, but his thoughts often lingered on Maribel Hayes. He had learned patience, had seen the smallest flickers of acknowledgement in her eyes, and now he sought ways to deepen their connection without shattering the fragile trust she had begun to show. He started with gentle gestures, small acts meant to show care rather than demand attention. He carried her water pail without comment, laid fresh blankets by the stove, and quietly repaired the creaking floorboard she trod on each night. Sometimes, he left small notes by her sketches, praising her work, offering words of encouragement. Each day, he watched for her response, no matter how slight, no matter how fleeting. A softened glance, a lingering touch on the stove's edge, a small nod, all were victories in this delicate, silent dance. Yet outside the walls of the ranch, curiosity and judgment stirred. The townsfolk whispered in hushed tones about Jonah's bride, about the woman who would not speak or look at him. "She's a mystery, that one," said the blacksmith, shaking his head. "Makes a man wonder what she's hiding." The gossip reached Jonah's ears more than once, though he ignored it outwardly. Inside, however, it was a reminder that Maribel carried not only her past but the eyes of a watchful town, their expectations and doubts pressing down like the snow on the prairie. Maribel herself remained cautious, but cracks began to appear in her carefully constructed walls. One afternoon, as Jonah repaired a section of the fence, he noticed her watching from the porch, sketchbook clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes followed his every movement, and when he paused, she quickly turned away, as if caught in a moment of vulnerability. Later, as he helped her carry firewood, she allowed him to take her hand briefly to steady her on the icy path. It was a small gesture, yet to Jonah it carried a weight far greater than any words could convey. Their interactions remained slow, deliberate, each step toward trust measured and cautious. Jonah faced an internal conflict every day, his desire for companionship clashing with the knowledge that any misstep could send her retreating further into silence. He found himself studying her mannerisms, learning the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle signs of comfort or unease, determined to respect her boundaries while nurturing the fragile connection that was beginning to form. The ranch itself became a place of quiet tension and anticipation. The fire's glow flickered against the cabin walls, casting shadows that danced like memories across the wooden floor. Jonah would sometimes catch her watching him without realizing it, her expression softening in the dim light. Those rare moments gave him hope, yet also reminded him of the patience still required. He understood that forcing conversation, pressing for attention, or demanding affection would undo all progress. Trust, he knew, could not be rushed. One evening, as the snow fell heavily outside and the wind rattled the windows, Jonah prepared a simple meal for them both. Maribel lingered near the stove, glancing at him with an almost imperceptible lift of her eyes. He offered her a piece of bread, and for the first time in weeks, she accepted without hesitation, meeting his gaze just long enough to acknowledge him before returning to her sketches. The gesture, small as it was, felt monumental, a sign that the walls around her heart were beginning to shift. Jonah leaned back in his chair by the fire, exhaustion and hope mixing in equal measure. Life on the frontier had tested him in many ways, but none had required the careful balance of strength and gentleness that Maribel demanded. And yet, he felt something stirring, an unspoken promise that if he continued to move with patience and courage, the woman who had refused to look at him might one day allow herself to be seen, fully and without fear. Outside, the prairie lay white and silent, holding its breath, waiting. Inside, the cabin flickered with firelight and quiet possibility, as two souls began the slow, deliberate work of trust and understanding, step by fragile step. The snowstorm came without warning, a sudden wall of white that swallowed the Callaway Ranch in its icy grip. Winds howled across the plains, rattling the cabin windows and shaking the skeletal trees outside. The world beyond the ranch seemed erased, leaving only the firelit interior and the uneasy silence that had long defined Jonah Callaway's home. Jonah moved quickly, securing shutters and stacking wood, his breath coming in thick puffs as the cold seeped through even the heaviest coat. He glanced at Maribel Hayes, who stood by the window, her eyes wide and tense as the storm battered the land. She had never seen a storm like this, not so fierce, not so consuming. He could see the fear in her stance, the tight grip on her sketches, the way she pressed herself against the wall as though seeking some unseen anchor. "Stay inside," Jonah said, voice firm yet gentle. "We'll be safe." She only nodded, her lips pressed together, her silence more telling than any words could be. The storm's fury grew, the wind tearing across the prairie like a wild animal. The horses stamped in the barn, uneasy and frightened, and Jonah's mind raced with possibilities. Trees could fall, fences could break, and the storm might bring dangers he could not predict. Then came the sound of movement outside the cabin, sharp and unnatural. A low growl, a rustle of snow-crusted bushes, and a figure stumbling through the storm. Jonah's heart leapt. A wild animal, or perhaps someone from Maribel's past, the outlaw she had never spoken of, now threatened the fragile peace he had fought to nurture. Without hesitation, he grabbed his rifle, moving toward the door with steady, controlled steps. Maribel followed at a distance, frozen with fear but unable to look away. The intruder emerged, a large timber wolf, drawn by hunger and the scent of life. It lunged toward Maribel, teeth bared, eyes glinting with feral intent. Jonah reacted instinctively, stepping between her and the animal, firing a warning shot that echoed through the storm. The wolf hesitated, snarled, then retreated into the white blur of snow, leaving a tense silence in its wake. Jonah turned to her, chest heaving. "You're safe," he said firmly. "I won't let anything harm you." Maribel's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, trembling. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, her composure broke entirely. Tears welled in her eyes, her hands shaking as she reached for the sketchbook she always carried. Jonah knelt beside her, cautious, offering warmth and protection without pressing for words. And then she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper, but heavy with years of pain and fear. He betrayed us, she said, referring to Silas Granger, the man whose shadow had haunted her life. He took everything, my family, my home. I promised myself I'd never trust a man again. Jonah listened, letting the words fall around him, letting her reveal the burden she had carried alone. The letters, the sketches, the locked trunk, all of it now made sense. She had built her walls not from cruelty, but from survival, from the need to protect herself from a world that had been cruel and unyielding. He reached out gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe here," he said, his voice unwavering. "I am not him. I will not betray you. I will protect you, always." For a long moment, Maribel's tears fell silently, her breath coming in shuddering gasps. Then, slowly, she leaned into his side, allowing the warmth of his presence to reach her frozen heart. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of safety and trust began to take hold, a bond forged through courage, protection, and the first steps toward genuine connection. Jonah knew that the revelation she had finally shared would change everything. The challenge of earning her trust had reached its crucible, and in the aftermath of the storm, the first real promise of understanding and love had emerged. The ranch, once cold and silent, now held the possibility of a shared life, tempered by hardship and strengthened by bravery. The storm had passed, leaving the plains blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow. The wind had died, and the world outside the Callaway Ranch was quiet, sparkling under the pale winter sun. Inside, the cabin smelled of firewood and warmth, and Jonah Callaway moved with careful attention, making sure every detail reflected safety and comfort. He knew the hardest part had come and gone, the revelation of Maribel Hayes past, but the work of truly connecting with her had only just begun. Maribel sat by the window, her sketchbook open in her lap, though she no longer drew. Her eyes, once averted from Jonah, now lingered on him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. For the first time, she spoke without hesitation, without the careful walls she had built around herself. "I never thought I'd survive the things he did," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "I never thought anyone could be trusted." Jonah knelt beside her, letting the firelight warm his face. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I've never wanted anything but to keep you safe. I will never betray you." Her gaze met his fully, and in that moment, the years of fear and guarded silence began to crumble. She allowed herself to lean closer, resting her hand lightly on his arm. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a heart opening for the first time. Jonah felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and love. He had waited for this moment, patiently, understanding that trust could not be forced, it had to be earned. They spent the afternoon in quiet conversation, the words flowing slowly at first, each revelation met with careful listening and gentle reassurance. Maribel shared fragments of her past, the betrayal by Silas Granger, the fear that had haunted her every step, and the pain of a family torn apart by violence. Jonah listened without judgment, without impatience. He understood that her story, though painful, had shaped the woman she was, and he respected every scar and every shadow. As the light of day faded, he took her hand fully in his, holding it gently. "I am not him," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "I will not hurt you. I will not betray you. I will be here, always, if you let me." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of release rather than fear. She allowed herself to rest her head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of his presence sink into her. The walls she had built around herself for so long, the walls of mistrust, of caution, of fear, were beginning to fall, brick by brick. She had finally found someone whose strength was matched by gentleness, whose courage was guided by love rather than selfish desire. Jonah, too, felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The loneliness that had haunted him for years, the ache of a life once shared and now empty, began to dissolve in the presence of the woman who had finally entrusted him with her heart. He had been patient, steadfast, and brave, and in return, he was rewarded with a bond deeper than he could have imagined. Even as the night settled over the snow-covered plains, the cabin glowed with warmth, laughter, and conversation, small, hesitant, yet full of promise. The frontier outside remained wild and unforgiving, but inside, a sanctuary had been built, forged by trust, courage, and the willingness to open one's heart despite the pain of the past. Maribel looked up at Jonah, her eyes bright with newfound trust. I believe in you, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I believe you're different. Jonah smiled, a quiet, steady smile that carried all the hope, patience, and love he had held onto for so long. And I'll spend every day proving it to you, he said, taking her hand in both of his. The moment was fragile, yet powerful, a turning point where fear gave way to hope, and silence gave way to trust. In the quiet warmth of the cabin, two hearts, once weighed down by loss and betrayal, began to beat together, each finding solace and strength in the other. The snow outside reflected the fading light, sparkling like a promise, as Jonah and Maribel sat together, the beginnings of love and understanding taking root in the heart of the frontier. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on the prairie, the snow softening under the pale warmth of the early sun. The Callaway Ranch, once rigid and silent in the cold, now felt alive with movement, with small sounds of shared life and quiet laughter. Jonah Callaway moved through the cabin with the ease of a man who had found purpose beyond labor alone. He chopped wood, fed the animals, and repaired fences, yet every action carried a new sense of meaning. He was not alone anymore. Maribel Hayes, once distant and guarded, had begun to settle into the rhythms of ranch life. She helped with the chores, carried water, and even assisted with the animals, her movements more confident, her voice soft but steady when she spoke. The sketches she had once guarded jealously now decorated the walls of the cabin, small windows into her heart, a bridge between her past and the present she was learning to embrace. They shared meals by the fire, exchanging stories in quiet conversation that was no longer forced, no longer tentative. Laughter occasionally broke the stillness of the room, the sound warm and rare, but genuine. Jonah noticed how her eyes would meet his now, lingering just long enough to show recognition, gratitude, and a spark of something deeper. She had begun to trust him fully, and in that trust, he found a fulfillment that went far beyond companionship. It was a connection of shared strength, respect, and burgeoning love. Outside, the prairie stretched in endless white, the wind gentle and forgiving compared to the storms of the past. Jonah and Maribel walked together along the fence line, the quiet crunch of snow beneath their boots punctuating the vast silence. Occasionally, she would glance at him, a small smile forming as they shared moments of mutual understanding. Their bond had grown slowly, carefully, tempered by patience, courage, and the trials they had endured together. It was not a love born of urgency or circumstance, but of resilience and choice, a love that would endure because it had been earned. The townsfolk, who once whispered doubts about Jonah's judgment and Maribel's silence, now regarded the pair with quiet admiration. Word spread of the storm that had tested their courage, of the bravery Jonah had shown, and the quiet strength Maribel had revealed in her eventual trust. They became a symbol of resilience, of hearts mending after loss, of trust forged in the harshness of the frontier. Evenings in the cabin became the most treasured time. They would sit by the fire, sharing stories of the past, hopes for the future, and small dreams that had been impossible during the years of isolation. The firelight danced across the walls, illuminating the sketches and letters that had once represented fear and secrecy, now transformed into evidence of survival, courage, and trust. On one particularly clear evening, Jonah and Maribel stood together on the porch, looking out at the snow-covered plains bathed in the golden light of sunset. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, yet it no longer felt lonely or intimidating. Jonah reached for Maribel's hand, holding it gently, feeling the warmth and softness that symbolized everything they had endured and everything they had built together. Maribel turned her face toward him, her eyes reflecting hope and gratitude. "I feel safe here," she said softly. "With you." Jonah smiled, a quiet, deep smile, one born of relief, love, and the quiet satisfaction of a heart that had waited patiently and been rewarded. "And I'll do everything I can to keep you safe," he replied. "Always." The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the prairie, and for the first time in years, Jonah Calloway felt the emptiness that had haunted him fade. The loneliness that had once weighed on his shoulders was gone, replaced by the steady presence of a woman who had taught him that patience, courage, and understanding could heal even the deepest wounds. Together, they stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the snow sparkling like tiny jewels in the fading light. Two hearts, once burdened by loss and fear, now beat together in quiet harmony. The Calloway Ranch was no longer just a place of work and survival. It had become a home, a sanctuary, and a testament to the power of trust, love, and resilience on the unforgiving frontier. In that golden light, the promise of tomorrow stretched endlessly before them, warm, bright, and filled with hope. The journey of two broken hearts had found its beginning, and the story of Jonah and Maribel had reached its first true peace. Did Jonah and Maribel's story touch your heart? Hit like and subscribe to hear more gripping Wild West tales of love, courage, and survival.